All right, so you should have your 6 kingdoms chart out. I believe there's 6 columns at the top. It's hard for me to see this version. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 columns. The 5 towards the right are going to be what you're filling out today. And there's not a lot of words you're going to have to write for most of them. The examples column, you'll have to write a good bit of words. But all the other ones, it's literally you can write 3 or 4 or 5 letters each for each box. So it should be easy. Above energy, go ahead and write now. Above energy, I want you to go ahead and write the possible things you're going to put in the boxes below. And so above energy, I want you to write producer, consumer, and decomposer. Write the full word out. Above energy, write producer, consumer, and decomposer. Above reproduction, write sexual, and what's the other one? Asexual. Above pro and eu, what do those 2 words stand for? Yeah, what does it stand for? Not what it means. You're right. Prokaryotic and eukaryotic, which means what?
Prokaryotic has no nucleus.
Has no nucleus if it's pro, and eu means what? It does have a nucleus. And honestly, before we do anything, you should be able to fill that out all the way down. But we'll talk about it. And then above cells, so above pro and eu, write prokaryotic and eukaryotic, above pro and eu. Above cells, write unicellular and what? Multicellular. And then above examples, you don't have to write anything. I'll be giving you examples as we go along. So go ahead and put your finger over or in the box where fungi would reproduce. And if you'll find fungi, that's this row. Reproduction is right here where those 2 intersect. That is where you're going to describe how fungi reproduce. If I said, give me examples of plants, that's going to be the last column to the right at the very top because that's where plantae is. So as we go through this, you're going to fill this chart out. If you'll notice, there's a really big line, and yours on the screen it's green. On yours it's going to be black and white most likely. Unless you printed this off at home. But there's a big line there, and that's going to split up the 2 major kingdoms. The domain above that is eukarya, which means it has what? Yeah, everything above that line, everything in eukarya is going to, all 4 of these kingdoms are going to have nuclei. The 2 below that line, archaea and eubacteria, and bacteria, are not going to have a nucleus. And in this document, I'll share this with you later, it has all the answers. There's all the answers, but I want you to fill this out using information that we're about to do. So, this is how this is going to go. We're going to go over a kingdom. I'll talk through it. Your pencils will be down. We'll talk through it, discuss everything. We'll move on through the slides. At the end, I'll change the slide. I want you to try to take notes from memory from the discussion. And before we move to the next kingdom, I'll say, does anybody have any questions? And at that point, you can ask me, say, hey, how does bacteria get energy again? Or how do plants reproduce? Is it sexual or asexual? So you can ask those questions at the end. But I want you to try to use discussion, remember what we're talking about, and then put it down on paper when you get that chance. If we could do it how I want to, we would not take notes. We would not have to write stuff down. But the reason that's beneficial is because you have several other classes as you're doing stuff. You have stuff after school. You have a life outside of this class. And so I want to make sure that you have a record of what's going on in class so you can study it later if need be. One last thing, at the end of today, you should have examples on the right column over there where it says examples. And I want you to draw something, and it doesn't have to be a masterpiece, but on the second column that says kingdom at the top, for each kingdom, I want you to draw an example there. So you could do an animal. You could draw a human or a horse or a lizard or whatever, an animal. For plantae, you're going to draw an example of a plant. It's going to be easy for those ones up top, I think. The harder ones are going to be Protists and the 2 at the bottom. So keep that in mind. And here are some pictures of each one as well on the slideshow. All right, Archaebacteria. Now, I want to tell you about Walker, Texas Ranger. So growing up, I watched a TV show called Walker, Texas Ranger, and it had a guy named Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris is an old man now. He is ancient. I think he's 79 years old. This is a dude who kind of scrapped with Bruce Lee. He and Bruce Lee did movies together. Chuck Norris, you can look it up later, but Chuck Norris had some kind of record, like he was the world champion something or another. I don't know what it was, karate or some kind of martial artist. Yeah, kickboxing maybe. But he was a bad dude. Like, he did not play around. This is not the guy, both in real life and in acting, he's not the guy that you wanted to mess with. Walker, Texas Ranger. We'll look at a video in a second, but Walker, Texas Ranger was a show I went home and I watched, and it is really cheesy, and I knew that at the time, but it's just one of those shows like, y'all ever watch these dumb shows? You know they're dumb, but it's just entertaining, and it's lighthearted, and you like it. It's not like a super awesome plot. A lot of Hallmark movies are like that, Lifetime movies. You know how they're going to end. Like you could easily guess what's going to happen. But Chuck Norris is like the Archaebacteria is like the Chuck Norris of the living world. Because two things. It's very old. It's ancient. He's 79 years old. He could probably still kick our butt. He's 79 years old. He's really old, and he's really extreme. Have y'all ever heard of Chuck Norris jokes? All right, so I'll go through some jokes for you. So Chuck Norris the jokes are kind of, they're supposed to be silly. So one was Chuck Norris, when he does a push-up, he doesn't push himself up. What does he do? He pushes the earth down. One time Chuck Norris got in a fight with a horse, and he uppercut the horse, and we call all the descendants of that horse giraffes. Chuck Norris can kill 2 stones with 1 bird. You know the saying, you kill a bird with 2 birds with 1 stone. He can kill 2 stones with 1 bird. When the boogeyman goes to sleep, the boogeyman checks under his bed and in his closet for Chuck Norris. Word on the street is Chuck Norris died like 2 years ago, but the Grim Reaper just hasn't had the guts to tell him yet. Chuck Norris once, as a prank, peed and he urinated in a semi truck's like gas tank. You know what the name of that semi truck's name is? Optimus Prime. You know who Optimus Prime is? The Autobot, the Autotron from Transformers. Chuck Norris tells Simon what to do. Chuck Norris is the reason that Waldo is hiding. Once a cobra bit Chuck Norris's leg, and after 5 days of excruciating pain, the cobra died. So these jokes are meant to be like, what? Are you serious? That doesn't make any sense. And we can go through and talk about some more in a second. But I just want you to understand, Chuck Norris, in my mind, Archaebacteria are the Chuck Norris of the 6 kingdoms. They're the Chuck Norris. They're the ones that scientists believe that early on, when the earth was a very rough place to live, Archaebacteria were there. Because they love super hot places. They love super salty places. So have y'all ever heard of the Dead Sea? Yes. You know why it's called the Dead Sea? Salt. Nothing lives in the Dead Sea almost. But you know what does live there? Salt. The Chuck Norris kingdom. Yes, Archaebacteria. Salt doesn't live there, no. Archaebacteria live there because they love salt. Archaebacteria can live in the morning glory pools, these hot geyser type pools. These pools are extremely hot. Like we would die if we jump in them. They are very, very hot. But Archaebacteria love that. They like extreme environments. So there's 3 for examples. In just a second, I'll leave this up here for you. There's 3 examples. You've got methane makers, which guess what they make? Methane gas. Don't write it down yet. They've got heat lovers, which another way to say love is philo. So like if you think of Philadelphia, Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Delphia, city. Philo means brotherly love. So when you say philo or phile, that means that you love something. So thermophile means you love heat. Halite is another word for salt. It's the mineral. Another word for halite is salt. Another word for salt is halite. Halite is the mineral salt. So if something is a halophile, it means it loves salt. What's an area that would be described, if these things lived in that area, they would be described as what? What did I just mention? A place that has a lot of salt that these places like, these things like? The Dead Sea. The Dead Sea. And so Archaebacteria, super ancient, like Chuck Norris, 79 years old, and very extreme. Very extreme. They like the extremes. They enjoy the extremes. As far as energy, Archaebacteria, it's not in the notes, it's not on the slide, but Archaebacteria get their energy. There's 3 different ways different organisms in this kingdom can get energy. So it's all 3 of those. Some of them are producers, and you can write that if you want to. Some pro, some con, some dec. Do you understand? Some of them are producers, some of them are consumers, and some of them are decomposers. Some of them are producers, some of them are consumers, and some of them are decomposers. That doesn't mean they're all. It's not like you look at an archaeobacteria and that archaeobacteria is a producer, consumer, and a decomposer. What I'm saying is it could be a producer, or it might be a consumer, or it might be a decomposer. All right, so archaeobacteria, they're prokaryotic because they're not in the domain eukarya. They are prokaryotic. They don't have a nucleus. They are unicellular. And binary fission. I don't believe we talked about binary fission, but it is a type of asexual reproduction. It's a type of asexual. And this looks just very similar if you were to draw out mitosis. Do you remember how we drew out mitosis? We have a parent cell and it splits off into how many? It splits off into two. Binary means two. Bi means two, like bicycle. And fission means, I think of fizz, the stuff at the top of your cup, like you pour a soda, Coke, into a cup, and the liquid separates from the gas, right? That's what fizz is, right? When the gas is escaping the liquid. The carbon dioxide is escaping up. That is fission. It's splitting off into two different groups. This is saying that binary fission, it splits something that's like mitosis. Mitosis would be an example of binary fission. So when I think of binary fission, I think of mitosis. It splits off into two. All right, let's go to eubacteria. Go and put your pencils down. Eubacteria. Prokaryotic, therefore you should know it's already unicellular, so prokaryotic and unicellular. In the same way that archaeobacteria can be, some of them are producers, some of them are consumers, some of them are decomposers. It's the same thing. They can be both. And you can read it down here at the bottom. It says, eubacteria are the most common form of bacteria and are found everywhere. They're under your fingernails, in your mouth, in your body. They're both helping you live, and some of the other ones are trying to kill you. So bacteria are everywhere you touch. They're covering your desk, reproducing on your desk. And they're reproducing by mitosis, by binary fission. Some examples are down here at the bottom. So when you go to do examples, have you all ever heard of this before? E. coli. And I can't remember the genus of this, but look, this is the scientific name, Escherichia coli, something like Escherichia coli. That is E. coli. We abbreviate the scientific name. What does the E stand for? I mean, what is Escherichia, but what does that mean? What, in this order of classification, what is it? Do I remember? This is the scientific name. In every scientific name, the first word is the what? The genus. The second word is the species. The same thing with staph. I believe it's Staphylococcus aureus, which is the genus and the species. It's written up here on the board. You see Staphylococcus aureus. We could write just S. aureus. It's on the marker board, over there. All right, so I believe that is eubacteria. Go ahead and from as much as you can from memory, and we'll talk about it in just a second. Go ahead and take it down in your notes. All right, fungi is very possibly my favorite kingdom. It's my favorite kingdom because I feel like in school I thought this was really lame, and fungi do some awesome stuff, some very strange stuff. So let's get the stuff first. Let's talk through it. It says most fungi are complex multicellular organisms. So would we be complex multicellular organisms? Yes. So most fungi are things that you can see with your eyes, we can see with our eyes. They're complex multicellular. However, some are unicellular. So when it comes time, you might want to say mostly multi, some uni. Not yet. Pencil down. It says fungi get their energy from decomposition. What does that mean? Where do they get energy from? Rotting is actually further past rotting stuff. So they're not scavengers, they're decomposers. They're breaking things down. The way that they reproduce, and that decomposition is going to be important. We'll talk about that in a couple of things when we talk about protists. They reproduce sexually and asexually. So they can reproduce sexually and asexually. And budding is one of the ways. So let's talk about budding. Budding, if you read it up there, says it's asexual form of reproduction where new cells form and then they break off. So imagine that, kind of like Groot. Imagine that you had a little mini you, that like a little mini you out of your shoulder today at lunch. You're like, oh hey, there's a little, okay, cool. There's a little like mini you, little head starting to poke out of your skin. And then by like 2 or 3 weeks from now, they're like it's torso. And then a couple months from now, you just take some scissors and you can kind of just pop it off like it's like an apple or something. And you've got a little mini you that in a couple years will be your size. Like that would be a very weird, exaggerated form of budding. Budding is when the organism starts growing its offspring off the side, and eventually it breaks off and goes on. Those are fungi. So fungi. Let's look at some examples of fungi. Now these may be gross. I warn you, I may ruin some of your favorite foods with this, but fungi have cells made of chitin. Let's talk about that first. Chitin is the same thing that bugs. If you've ever stepped on a old cockroach or an old beetle, like there's nothing left in the cockroach or the beetle, what kind of sound? Does it make a squish sound? What does it make? Really loud crunchy noise. That's like you're essentially crunching their skeleton. You are crunching their skeleton because they have an exoskeleton. Now that bug looks exactly the same that it did when it was alive because all of its guts, all the soft parts of it are on the inside. Its exoskeleton is made of chitin, which is made of the same stuff that fungi are made of. And if you look right here, we can see an example of how that's beneficial here. So we have lichen. Have y'all ever seen this stuff? This stuff is things that are on sticks. Now it's kind of a greenish gray, if you've seen that. Maybe a little blue hue. It's a greenish gray. It's green because of the algae. We'll talk about algae in a second. Algae is a protist. It's not a plant. But it does. How does algae get its energy? Photosynthesis. So it is a producer. Where does algae normally exist? In water. It's surrounded by water. Not just like a wet puddle, like a puddle on the ground, but a lot of water. So how does algae grow on a stick in lichen? How does it protect itself from dehydration and getting too dry? The fungus surrounds it. In the same way that an exoskeleton of an insect keeps water from evaporating out of it, the algae protects itself or is protected by the lichen that surrounds it. So the algae is photosynthesizing and making sugar from the sun. The lichen is decomposing dead stuff, and they're helping each other. The lichen protects the algae. The lichen protects the algae. So if you look at this one over here, I've got a stick right here. This one does not look greenish. Do you know why this lichen does not look greenish? Because the algae is gone. It's just the leftovers, what you can see remaining of the lichen. The algae is gone. It looks brown and brown colored, because the lichen is all that stuff, that chitin. So it's kind of like that dead insect. It looks like it's the same, maybe slightly a little bit different, but it's dead. There is no life left in that lichen. It's dead. So the fungus and the algae work together. So let's go back. Sac fungi. Oh, molds. Y'all ever had something in the back of your fridge? Had a container? It's been shut for 3 months. You didn't know it fell back in the back there or whatever, and it was, gumbo surprise or potato souffle or something that was in a container. You left it back there, and it started growing carpet-like fuzz. You know what I'm talking about? So how did that fungus get in there? Was it in there when you shut the lid?
No.
Yes. It grew in there. So when you shut that lid, the fungus most likely did not get through that plastic into that container. The fungus spores, the babies, the seeds of that spore, of the fungus, were already there. It just needed time to start growing. We are constantly breathing in fungal spores all the time. All the time. And so those fungal spores can turn into like this one right here is a mold, a shapeless fungi, fuzzy looking. So some of those things that grow in your food, I believe those are a type of fungus. Also, sac fungi. Who's ever heard of yeast? Okay. I'm going to be a little vulgar for a second. So the holes that are in your bread, do y'all know what I'm talking about? Have you guys ever been making a PB&J and there's a big old whopping hole there that the jelly falls through? You know what I'm talking about? If that is a large group of it, but if you'll look at the bread closely, your bread, if it's leavened bread like most bread, it's going to have thousands of little bitty holes all throughout it. Have y'all noticed that before? Like you can't see through it unless it's thin. If it was thin enough, you'd be able to see through it, but a normal slice of bread, you can't see through it, but there's holes all the way through. It looks like a sponge, kind of. Those little holes are made of fungi farts, essentially, if you think about it like that. So that fungi is a yeast. When somebody was making that bread, that yeast worked its way all throughout the batch. It was breaking down sugars, decomposing some of the nutrients, some of the carbohydrates that are in there, and giving off gas. So let's just not call it farts, even though that's kind of what it is. When we pass gas, that's what it's called. When other organisms, like a tree, gets rid of its gas, it's called carbon dioxide, or the thing that's giving off is carbon dioxide. When a fungus gives off that, or when the sac fungi, the yeast, gives off that gas, it creates little pockets in the bread, and then in the baking process, the fungi dies, and that pocket is left. Does that make sense? So imagine all of us and 100 other people were all in a pool of Jell-O, and we had a little scuba mask on, and we all at the same time went, and we breathed out. What would happen to the surface? The bubbles can't go up through the Jell-O. What's going to happen to the surface of the Jell-O? It's flat before we breathe. What's going to happen after we breathe? It's going to raise up, right? Because there's a bunch of air pockets all in there. That's what's happening to bread as the yeast is giving off those gases. The bread goes from a pretty solid mass to a solid with a bunch of air pockets all through it. That's why your bread is fluffy when it has yeast, and unleavened bread, which bread that does not have yeast, is normally very flat and dense. I don't know if y'all have ever had unleavened bread, but it's very flat. And club fungi, that's another example. So you've got molds, you have sac fungi, club fungi. You can mention any of those in your examples. And we've also got lichen. You don't have to mention lichen. I just thought that was cool. So go ahead and take those notes. Another thing that's cool, the reason I love fungi is what they can do under the ground. So the largest organism that I'm aware of that we know as humans is a fungus. It is miles wide. So imagine you do 4 laps out at the track. That is a mile. 4 laps is 1 mile. So if you spread all of those out, that is 1 mile. The largest organism that we know of, that I'm aware of, is in Oregon. I believe it's in Oregon, where there's a temperate rainforest. It is miles wide. Think about that. We measure whales and massive trees by the foot or by the yard. This one's measured by the mile. It is massive. But because fungi grow under the ground. So if I asked you, I said, hey, go over to that fungi and kill it. And you went over and you grabbed the mushroom, snatched that mushroom up, threw it in a 5-gallon bucket, poured gas all over it, went a far way, lit it on fire, and it's just burning, burning, burning. You come back, there's just ash. Did you kill the fungi? Why?
Because there's still more.
What do you mean? No, did you kill the fungi that came from?
No.
No. So that's the same as if I go to an apple tree and I say, hey, go kill that apple tree. And you walk over there and you snatch an apple off that apple tree and you go and do the same thing. You squish it, you throw it in there, you catch it on fire. It's just ash. Nothing left that looks like the apple again. The seeds are ruined, everything. And you said, I killed that apple tree. Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Because you killed the fruit. You killed the fruit of the apple. What is the purpose of an apple or any fruit? Not to eat. The apple doesn't say, hey, I'm going to make some apples to eat. What is the purpose of an apple? To reproduce. The purpose of a mushroom is to reproduce. The mushroom is the fruit of an organism that is below the ground, typically, or in a tree. Sometimes it's in a tree. Have you all ever seen fungi like mushrooms growing out of a tree? So fungi are typically under the ground where it's wet and warm, moist. It can grow. Not a lot of sunlight. It does not need to be dry. And so those fungi can work with plants and get them nutrients, or sometimes they will decompose the plants when they're dead. But fungi are generally they're under the ground and they can spread very far apart. Like it's not uncommon for them to be several meters, several yards long under the ground, like in the woods out there. I think I told y'all before that the fungi can actually partner up with a tree, and the tree gives the fungi sugar from photosynthesis, and the fungi can go and get nutrients from 30, 40 feet over, bring water and nutrients to the tree, and they switch, they barter. It's like a farmer and a blacksmith. The farmer gives the blacksmith food, the blacksmith gives the farmer tools to work and make food, and they are constantly helping each other. All right, let's go to the next one. Plants, I think you can get this one pretty easily. You can go ahead and write these ones down. Plants are eukaryotic because what domain are they in? Eukarya. They all have nuclei. They're eukaryotic because they have nuclei, and you can tell that because they're in the eukarya domain. They reproduce sexually and asexually. So an apple tree can reproduce sexually and asexually. We can make it happen asexually, and it can happen on its own asexually. I'm sorry. We can make it happen asexually, and it can happen sexually. Plants are producers. They make their own food, and there's examples like a pitcher plant or a Venus flytrap, which they are eating insects. I believe those are mostly going to be getting minerals from from those animals. But even if they are getting some energy, their primary way of getting food is going to be from photosynthesis. All right, animals, I think it's the same thing. I think you could probably fill this out without any help. They're multicellular. They're eukaryotic. They produce sexually or asexually. I don't know what the percentages are, but I believe that they're going to be predominantly, they're going to be mostly sexual reproduction. There's some lizards that can reproduce asexually. There's some social insects like like ants. I believe that male ants don't have a father. A male ant is born from an egg that is unfertilized. And so it's not that they don't know their father, they never met their father. They don't have a father. All right, protists. This is going to be the most difficult one we're going to talk about because it's not tangible. Plants, animals, and fungi you've seen. Bacteria, I think you can imagine. Protista, go and put your pencils down. I want you to listen to this. No writing on this one. Protista. Remember there's 4 kingdoms in eukarya. Plants, animals, fungi, and those we've talked about. The last one is protista. If an organism has a nucleus, what domain is it going to be in? Eukarya. If it's like a plant, but it's not a plant, it's going to be a protist. If it's like an animal, but it's not an animal, it's going to be a protist. If it's like a fungus, but not a fungus, it's going to be a protist. This is the junk drawer. In my mind, this is how I categorize. This is the junk drawer of the eukarya domain. Y'all hear me? If it doesn't, it's like, I see this thing, it's like a plant, or it's like an animal, or it's like a fungus, but it's not actually one of those. It is a protist. Let's just throw this in this drawer because we don't actually have a place for it. And so here's some examples. So real quick at the top, it's eukaryotic. It can produce sexually, and some of them can produce sexually, some of them can produce asexually. They are mostly single-celled, so when you go to write, I would write mostly single or mostly uni, some multi. And they're classified by the way they get energy. So under energy, you're going to have all 3 of these. So you can just write, when you do that, you can write all 3. But on the examples, you're going to have to write, this is going to be the most you're going to have in one box. You're going to have to write small or just write over there on the margin as well. This yellow thing, I believe I've seen this at my old house. So on top of pine straw, that's like 3 or 4 inches thick, there was this yellow slime stuff. It looked like cat throw up that was kind of gelatinous, like a Jell-O. Or it looked like, I don't know if y'all have ever stepped in dog poop, like playing football, playing barefoot. I remember stepped in a lot of dog poop as a kid. And there's different consistencies. There's one consistency that's like it's gritty, and the other consistency is like it's super slimy. This is like the super slimy kind. When it's early on, when it's yellow. But if I showed you this a week later, a picture of this, and this isn't my picture, but if I showed, no, that may be my picture actually. If I showed you this a week later, it would be brown and rusty looking, and if you stepped on it, it's dusty. Now, it's not a mushroom, it's not a fungus, but it's what? Fungus-like. So it gets energy through decomposition, and 2 examples are slime mold. So when you write this, in examples, you'll write fungus-like, and you can just write a dash, and you write slime mold or water mold. Next one. Plant-like. Have you guys ever heard of algae? Algae is a protist. It looks like a plant. It behaves like a plant. But scientists do not consider it a plant. Another word for these things are called phytoplankton. Have you ever heard of plankton before? Yeah. Not the guy on SpongeBob. But phyto, what does phyto sound like? Another word we've talked about. That produces their own food. What's that process called? Photosynthesis. These are plankton that make their own food. Have y'all seen algae before? The green stuff on some ponds and stuff, or if you've been in the ocean, maybe some in there. Algae are called phytoplankton. They're like plants. How are they like plants? How do they get energy? Photosynthesis. But they're not plants, so they're a protist. And the last one, they are animal-like. How are they animal-like? Not producers, not decomposers. They're consumers. And these are called, you'll see up here, they're called zooplankton or zooplankton. What do you go to the zoo to see? Animals. These are plankton that behave like animals. So if you imagine yourself, remember the Battle at Kruger video that we watched with all the animals that are crocodile and wildebeest and lion that are fighting? Imagine that you're in Africa on a safari and you see that happen. You see all this grass producers being eaten by herbivores, And you see a carnivore come in and kill one of the animals, eat it, and then you see a vulture come in and eat it, and then you see decomposure. Like you see the whole, over several days, if you're camping nearby, you see the whole food chain from producer to consumer to decomposer. That can happen in a drop of water with protists. So a drop of water could have an algae that's sitting there nice and green, and then you see this little blob come over and it eats the algae through endocytosis. Remember that process of going through the cell membrane. It just blobs over it. And then eventually you see that little cell just kind of explode. The cell wall breaks, or cell membrane breaks, and all of its guts go everywhere. And then you see another organism come along and go and slurps it all up and it eats it. You see a producer, a consumer, and a decomposer, all in one drop of water in a microscope. So protists are like animals, they're like plants, or they're like fungi, but they're not animals or plants or fungi. Does that make sense? Okay, go ahead and write that down.